The alarm bells were ringing again in the Galactic Confederation headquarters. Ambassador Kang Minho looked up from his morning coffee as red lights flashed across his office walls. Another trade ship had been destroyed in the Outer Rim territories. That made it the fifth one this week. Minho walked to his window and stared out at the busy space lanes around the capital station. Ships from 100 different worlds moved in careful patterns, bringing goods and people to the heart of galactic civilization. It was peaceful here, safe. But out in the Outer Rim, things were very different. For 30 years, 7 warlords had been fighting each other for control of those distant territories. Each one commanded massive fleets and controlled dozens of star systems. They had turned entire regions of space into war zones, where merchant ships disappeared and colonies lived in constant fear. The communication device on his desk buzzed. "Ambassador Minho, please report to the High Council chambers immediately." Minho finished his coffee and straightened his simple black suit. He had been expecting this call. The Confederation had tried everything to stop the fighting. They had sent their best negotiators, their smartest strategists, even their most powerful military forces. Nothing worked. The 7 warlords kept fighting, and innocent people kept dying. The High Council chambers were packed when he arrived. Representatives from dozens of worlds sat in curved rows, all talking at once. At the center, Chancellor Vexstar stood at his speaking platform. The tall alien's 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he called for order. "Fellow representatives," Chancellor Vexstar began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "We face a crisis that threatens the stability of our entire region. The Outer Rim conflicts have now lasted 3 decades. Trade routes are closing. Colonies are being abandoned. We must act." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the situation was bad, but hearing it stated so clearly made it seem worse. "We have tried conventional diplomacy," the Chancellor continued. "Ambassador Threx of the Velthari spent 6 months attempting negotiations. The warlords destroyed his ship before he could reach the meeting point." More worried voices filled the chamber. The Velthari were famous throughout the galaxy for their diplomatic skills. If they had failed, what hope was there? "We sent the Nexari with their mathematical conflict resolution systems. The warlords used their computers for target practice. We even asked the ancient Elderkin to attempt their mystical meditation rituals. 2 of their wise ones are still missing." Minho shifted in his seat. He had read all the reports. Every species in the Confederation had tried their best approaches to peace. Advanced psychology, superior technology, ancient wisdom, economic, incentives, even military pressure. The 7 warlords had ignored, destroyed, or defeated every attempt. "However," Chancellor Vexstar said, his tone changing, "our analysis computers have identified one approach we have not yet attempted. The data shows that human diplomatic methods have a success rate of 73.6% in situations that other species consider impossible." The chamber fell silent. All eyes turned toward the small human delegation. Minho felt dozens of alien gazes focusing on him and his colleagues. Therefore, the High Council has decided to send a human representative to negotiate with the 7 warlords of the Outer Rim. The silence stretched until someone in the back rows called out, "Which human?" Chancellor Vexstar's 4 eyes focused on Minho. "Ambassador Kang Minho has been selected for this mission." The chamber erupted in noise. Some representatives shouted protests. Others asked questions. A few species that communicated through color changes were flashing angry patterns. Through it all, Minho sat quietly, trying to process what he had just heard. After the session ended, Minho found himself in a briefing room with Admiral Chen Hyuk, the head of Confederation military forces, and Dr. Sarah Volkov, the chief xenopsychologist. "With respect, Ambassador," Admiral Chen said, "this seems like suicide. These warlords have been killing each other for 30 years. What makes anyone think they will listen to you?" Dr. Volkov pulled up holographic displays showing each of the 7 warlords. "Let me introduce you to your negotiating partners," she said grimly. "First, we have Warlord Raxtool of the Crimson Fleet. He controls 47 star systems and has a fleet of over 3,000 warships. His favorite negotiating tactic is orbital bombardment. The hologram showed a massive alien in red power armor. Even in the recording, he looked dangerous. Next is Warlord Chindar of the Shadow Syndicate. She specializes in stealth attacks and assassination. Her people can become invisible at will. 12 diplomatic missions have simply vanished when they tried to contact her." Minho studied the shimmering figure in the hologram. The alien seemed to fade in and out of visibility, even while standing still. "Then we have Warlord Morgoth of the Iron Brotherhood," Dr. Volkov continued. "Half machine, half organic, completely ruthless. His cybernetic enhancements include weapon systems that can level city blocks." The display showed a being that looked more like a walking tank than a person. Mechanical parts had replaced most of his original body. "Warlord Zixara of the Void Hunters exists partially in other dimensions. Standard weapons cannot even hit her fleet. Warlord Kethmal of the Star Reavers commands insect-like warriors who fight in swarms of millions. Warlord Nullvex of the Deaths. Head Corsairs is known for eating his enemies, literally eating them." Each hologram looked more terrifying than the last. These were not politicians or business people. They were warlords who had survived 30 years of constant warfare by being more dangerous than anyone else. Finally, Warlord Talarix of the Bone Fleet. His people practice necromancy. They raise the dead to fight in their armies. Even their own casualties come back to continue fighting. Admiral Chen shook his head. "Ambassador, these are not reasonable people. They are killers who have built empires on violence. What could you possibly offer them that would make them stop fighting?" Minho looked at the 7 holograms surrounding him. Each warlord controlled resources that most planets could only dream of. They had wealth, power, and military might. Traditional diplomatic offers like trade agreements or territorial concessions would mean nothing to them. "I do not know yet," Minho admitted. "But I have to try." Dr. Volkov handed him a datapad thick with psychological profiles and cultural analysis. "This contains everything we know about their species, their motivations, their histories. Maybe you can find something the others missed." That evening, Minho sat in his quarters aboard the diplomatic ship Harmony Edge, reviewing the files. His aide, Lieutenant Park Hana, brought him dinner and sat down across from him. "Sir," she said carefully, "everyone is calling this a suicide mission. Do you really think you can succeed where everyone else has failed?" Minho looked out at the stars through his cabin window. Tomorrow they would enter the Outer Rim territories where 7 warlords had been killing each other for longer than some species had been spacefaring. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but maybe that is the problem. Everyone who went before had a plan. They knew exactly what they wanted to achieve and how they wanted to achieve it. Maybe what these warlords need is someone who does not have all the answers." Lieutenant Park looked confused. "Sir?" Minho smiled and opened the thermal container. He had packed that morning. The smell of his grandmother's kimchi filled the small cabin. "My grandmother always said that the best conversations happen around a dinner table. She also said that no one stays angry on a full stomach." "You're planning to feed them?" "I am planning to treat them like people instead of problems to be solved," Minho said. "Everyone else has approached them as warlords first. Maybe it is time someone approached them as individuals who might be tired of fighting." The next morning, the Harmony Edge approached the neutral station where the unprecedented meeting would take place. Through the viewports, they could see the assembled fleets of all 7 warlords. Thousands of warships from 7 different factions formed distinct groups around the station, weapons powered but not yet firing. "Sir," Lieutenant Park said, her voice tight with worry, "the station is reporting that each warlord has brought enough firepower to destroy small moons. If this goes badly, then we will face the consequences together, Minho said calmly. He picked up his thermal container and walked toward the airlock. But first, let us see if anyone is hungry. As the diplomatic shuttle carried him toward the station, Minho looked back at the massive fleets surrounding them. Somewhere in those ships were 7 beings who had been fighting for 30 years. Tomorrow they would all sit down together, for the first time. He patted the thermal container in his lap and smiled. His grandmother would have loved this challenge. The meeting hall looked like a fortress designed by 7 different armies who all hated each other. Minho stepped through the airlock and immediately understood why so many previous diplomatic missions had failed. This was not a place built for conversation. It was a place built for war. Each warlord had claimed a section of the massive circular chamber. Energy barriers separated each area from the others, humming with enough power to stop tank rounds. Armed guards stood at attention. Behind each barrier, their weapons clearly visible and ready for use. The air itself seemed thick with tension and barely controlled violence. Warlord Raxtool arrived first. His heavy boots made the entire station shake with each step. The massive alien stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered from head to toe in red power armor that gleamed under the harsh lights. Behind him marched 20 soldiers in matching armor, their weapons scanning the room for threats. They took their position behind the energy barrier and waited. Next came Warlord Chindar. Her arrival was much quieter. One moment, the second section, was empty, and the next moment she was simply there, as if she had stepped out of thin air. Her form flickered between visible and invisible, a natural ability of her species that made Minho's eyes water trying to focus on her. Around her, more shapes moved in the shadows, her stealth operatives taking positions that no one else could see. Warlord Morgoth clanked into the third section like a walking machine shop. Half of his body had been replaced with mechanical parts that whirred and clicked with each movement. His cybernetic eye swept the room, scanning and analyzing everything it saw. His warriors looked almost as mechanical as he did, their bodies enhanced with weapons and armor that made them barely recognizable as living beings. The fourth section filled with a strange shimmer as Warlord Zixara phase-shifted into reality. Her people existed partially in other dimensions, which made them incredibly difficult to fight but also difficult to look at. She seemed to flicker between being solid and being made of light, while her warriors phased in and out of visible space around her. Warlord Kethmal arrived with the sound of 1,000,000 tiny feet. His insect-like warriors swarmed into the fifth section in perfect formation, their chittering voices creating a low buzz that filled the air. Kethmal himself stood in the center of the swarm, his own insect features clicking with what might have been agitation or anticipation. The sixth section suddenly filled with the smell of sulfur and the sound of growling. Warlord Nulvex and his Deathhead Corsairs looked exactly as dangerous as their reputation suggested. Nulvex himself was covered in scars and battle trophies taken from defeated enemies. His warriors showed their teeth when they smiled, and those teeth looked very sharp. Finally, Warlord Talorix entered with an entourage that made everyone else in the room uncomfortable. His Bonefleet warriors included both the living and the dead, reanimated corpses that served alongside breathing soldiers. The smell of decay mixed with the sulfur already in the air, creating an atmosphere that would have sent most diplomats running. 7 of the most dangerous beings in known space took their positions behind their energy barriers. Weapons were ready. Shields were active. Everyone watched everyone else with the kind of attention that came from 30 years of trying to kill each other. Then Minho walked into the center of the room. The contrast was almost comical. Where the warlords wore armor and brought armies, Minho wore a simple black suit and carried a thermal container. Where they had weapons that could destroy cities, he had chopsticks. Where they had spent decades building reputations for violence, he had spent the morning cooking. "Good morning, everyone," he said in clear galactic standard, setting his container on the central table. I am Kang Minho, and I brought lunch. The silence that followed was so complete that Minho could hear the humming of the energy barriers and the breathing of several dozen warriors. 7 pairs of alien eyes stared at him, as if he had just announced that he planned to juggle antimatter. Warlord Raxtul was the first to speak. His voice boomed through his armor's speakers like distant thunder. Human, we are here to discuss territorial disputes that have lasted 30 years. This is not a social gathering. You are absolutely right, Minho agreed, opening his thermal container. The smell of fermented vegetables, garlic, and carefully balanced spices began to fill the room. It is a working lunch. When did you last eat? The question seemed to catch Raxtul off guard. Through his armor's speakers, they could hear him processing the unexpected query. I do not see how that is relevant to territorial negotiations. Well, Minho said, pulling out plates and chopsticks, I spent months studying your conflict patterns. Your most successful military campaigns happened after your fleets had time to rest and resupply. Your worst defeats occurred when your forces were tired and hungry. You fight better when you are well-fed and rested. He began arranging portions of kimchi on 7 different plates, each one adjusted for the dietary requirements he had researched. The same pattern holds true for everyone else here. When your people are healthy and comfortable, you make better decisions. When they are stressed and hungry, you make mistakes. Warlord Kindar's shimmering form moved closer to her energy barrier. You think you can end our conflicts with vegetables? Fermented vegetables, Minho corrected with a smile. My grandmother always said that fermentation was the key to many things. You take something ordinary, give it time and the right conditions, and it becomes something better, something that can last for years without spoiling. He continued arranging the food while he talked. I figure if we are going to solve a 30-year war, we should do it properly. Besides, I have never met a problem that could not be improved by good food and honest conversation. Warlord Kethmol's mandibles clicked rapidly, which his translator rendered as curiosity mixed with confusion. You traveled across half the galaxy to feed us? I traveled across half the galaxy to meet you, Minho replied. The food is just how my people show respect and friendship. In human culture, sharing a meal means you want to know someone as a person, not just as a title or a reputation. Something strange began to happen in the room. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted. Instead of 7 warlords preparing for battle, there were now 7 individuals trying to understand what this unusual human was doing. Warlord Morgoth's cybernetic eye focused on the food. Our species has different dietary requirements. What you have prepared may not be suitable for our consumption. I spent 3 weeks researching the nutritional needs of all 7 species, Minho said. What I have here should be safe and hopefully pleasant for everyone. But if you have specific concerns, I can adjust the recipes. He gestured to Raxtul's portion. For silicon-based metabolism, I added mineral compounds that should provide the trace elements your people need. For Chindar's energy-based digestive system, I included bioelectric enhancers that should phase shift with her molecular structure. Each plate had been specifically designed for its intended recipient. Minho had clearly spent considerable time and effort making sure that everyone could participate safely. Of course, he added, no one has to eat anything they do not want. 2. This is just an offer, not a requirement. Warlord Nulvex leaned forward, his scarred face showing something that might have been amusement. Human, do you understand who we are? We have been killing each other for 30 years. Some of us have literally eaten our enemies. You walk in here with lunch and expect us to become friends? I expect you to be people, Minho replied simply. People who have been fighting for a very long time and might be tired of it. People who have responsibilities to their fleets and their territories and their families. People who might want to find a better way forward if someone gave them the chance. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was thoughtful rather than hostile. Warlord Talorix spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the chill of deep space. "What if we refuse your offer, human? What if we choose to continue as we have?" Minho shrugged. "Then you continue as you have. I am not here to force anyone to do anything. I am here to offer an alternative. If you prefer the status quo, that is your choice to make." He finished arranging the plates and stepped back. "But I will point out that the status quo has not been working very well for anyone. Your territories are war zones. Your people live in fear. Your resources are being spent on weapons instead of prosperity. Maybe it is time to try something different." The 7 warlords looked at the food, then at each other, then at the small human who had somehow made their fortress meeting hall feel like a dining room. "Very well," Warlord Raxtool said finally. "We will try your approach, human Minho. But understand that this changes nothing. We are still enemies." "Of course," Minho agreed. "But even enemies can be polite to each other, especially when they are all reasonable people who want what is best for their followers." One by one, the energy barriers powered down. For the first time in 30 years, the 7 warlords of the Outer Rim sat down together without weapons, drawn. They reached for the plates that a human diplomat had prepared for them, and they began to eat lunch together. What happened next would change the galaxy forever. 3 days after the first shared meal, something impossible was happening aboard the neutral station. The rigid battle lines that had defined 30 years of warfare were beginning to blur, not through conquest or surrender, but through the simple act of eating together. It started with small changes that no one expected. Warlord Kethmol discovered that his insect-like digestive system actually processed the fermented kimchi better than his usual liquid nutrients. The complex flavors seemed to stimulate responses in his nervous system that he had never experienced before. His mandibles clicked with what his translator interpreted as pleasure. "This is unexpectedly satisfactory, human Minho," he said during the second day's lunch. "My people consume only processed nutrition fluids. We did not know that solid foods could provide such sensations." "Thank you, Kethmol," Minho replied, serving another portion. "And please, just call me Minho. We are all colleagues here." The word colleagues seemed to hang in the air like a small revolution. These beings had been mortal enemies for 3 decades. The idea that they could be anything else was completely new. By the 3rd day, Minho had begun adapting his cooking to accommodate each warlord's specific needs and preferences. When Warlord Zixara mentioned that her phase-shifting biology had trouble processing certain proteins, Minho spent an entire evening researching Void Hunter dietary requirements. The next morning, he presented her with a modified version of bulgogi that could phase-shift along with her molecular structure. When she tasted it and her form solidified completely for the first time since arriving at the station, everyone noticed. Among her people, becoming fully solid was a sign of deep contentment and trust. It meant she felt completely safe and relaxed. "How did you know to do this?" she asked, her voice carrying wonder as she remained fully visible. "I asked your medical officer about your species' biology," Minho explained. "He was very helpful. Once he understood that I wanted to make sure you could enjoy the meal safely." The other warlords exchanged glances. The idea of asking an enemy for help, even with something as simple as dietary requirements, was foreign to them. But Minho had done it naturally, as if cooperation was the most obvious approach to any problem. The real breakthrough came during a heated argument about mining rights in the Kepler disputed zone. The 7 warlords had been shouting at each other for nearly an hour, old grievances and territorial claims flying back and forth like weapons fire. Voices were raised, hands were moving toward weapons, and the careful peace of the shared meals seemed about to shatter. Then Minho started laughing. The sound was so unexpected that everyone stopped arguing and stared at him. 7 of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy watched as a human diplomat wiped tears from his eyes and tried to control his amusement. "I am sorry," he said, still chuckling. "It is just that you are all fighting over who gets to strip mine. A bunch of rocks, but none of you have actually been there recently, have you?" The question caught them completely off guard. Territory was territory. You fought for it because it was yours, or because you wanted it to be yours. Whether it was actually worth fighting for was rarely considered. "I took the liberty of commissioning a recent survey of the Kepler zone," Minho continued, activating a holographic display above the dining table. "The results were quite interesting." The hologram showed a detailed map of the disputed system. What it revealed made several warlords lean forward in surprise. "The Kepler disputed zone has been completely mined out for 15 years, Minho announced. "You are literally fighting over empty space and worthless debris. There has been nothing valuable there since before some of your younger officers were born." The silence was profound. 30 years of conflict. Thousands of ships destroyed. Millions of lives lost. All for a prize that no longer existed. Furthermore, Minho added, highlighting different sections of his display, "There are 3 unexplored systems just outside your current territories that contain more rare minerals than the Kepler zone ever had. Instead of fighting over scraps, why not work together to explore new opportunities?" Warlord Morgoth was the first to speak, his cybernetic voice carrying a note of something that might have been embarrassment. "You mean we have been killing each other over nothing?" "Not nothing," Minho corrected gently. "Pride, tradition, fear of appearing weak, unwillingness to be the first one to back down. I understand those feelings, but maybe it is time to consider whether those things are worth more than the actual prosperity and safety of your people." That evening, as they shared what had become their regular dinner, the conversations were completely different. Instead of territorial posturing and threats, they began discussing practical matters. How would joint exploration work? What would fair resource distribution look like? Who would command which operations? How could they coordinate their different technologies and approaches? Lieutenant Park Hana, who had arrived with supply ships on the second day, watched in amazement as Warlord Talorix politely passed condiments to Warlord Kindar while they discussed mining equipment specifications. The sight of a necromancer sharing table manners with a stealth operative would have been unthinkable a week earlier. "Sir," she whispered to Minho during a brief break, "how is this actually working? These people have been trying to kill each other for 30 years. Minho considered the question while watching Warlord Kethmol demonstrate proper chopstick technique to an fascinated Rax tool. The massive armored warlord was trying to manipulate the small utensils with fingers designed for crushing enemies, but he was approaching the task with the same determination he brought to military campaigns. "I think they were all just tired of fighting and nobody wanted to be the first one to admit it," Minho said thoughtfully. "Sometimes you need an outsider to give everyone permission to try something different. When I offered them lunch instead of a battle plan, I was giving them permission to be people instead of warlords. And the food actually matters? My grandmother used to say that it is hard to hate someone after they have fed you," Minho replied. "But I think it is more than that. When you share a meal, you are saying, 'I trust you enough to be vulnerable with you.' You are sitting down, putting away weapons, focusing on something other than conflict. It changes the entire dynamic of every interaction." As if to prove his point, Warlord Nulvex, whose species was naturally carnivorous and had historically eaten captured enemies, was attempting to recreate Minho's vegetable pancake recipe. Warlord Zixara was offering advice on proper batter consistency, her form, flickering with amusement as the fierce corsair struggled with the unfamiliar ingredients. "Besides," Minho added with a smile, "everyone makes better decisions when they are not hungry. Hunger makes people angry and impatient. Feed someone well, and they become more willing to listen and more creative in their thinking." The changes were not limited to the negotiating sessions. Throughout the station, crews from different fleets were beginning to interact in ways that would have been impossible before. Maintenance workers from the Iron Brotherhood were sharing technical knowledge with engineers from the Crimson Fleet. Void Hunter scientists were comparing notes with Bone Fleet researchers about dimensional physics and necromantic energy. Remarkably, young officers from different factions had begun eating together in the station's general mess hall. These were people who had grown up expecting to spend their lives fighting each other, but they were discovering that they had more in common than they had differences. On the evening of the third day, as Minho prepared for what he hoped would be more productive negotiations the next morning, he received a message that would change everything. Long-range sensors had detected a massive fleet approaching the system. The configuration was unknown, but the size was alarming. The 7 Warlords were about to face their first test as something other than enemies. An external threat was coming, and they would have to decide whether the fragile cooperation they had built around a dining table was strong enough to survive a real crisis. Minho looked out at the assembled fleets of his new colleagues and hoped. That lunch had been enough to build the foundation for something stronger. They were about to find out whether shared meals could create bonds strong enough to face the unknown together. The alarm bell started screaming at 3 in the morning, station time. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as proximity sensors detected something that made every military officer on the station stop breathing for a moment. A massive fleet had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, and they were not friendly. Minho woke to the sound of running feet in the corridors and urgent voices speaking in a dozen different languages. He pulled on his clothes and rushed to the command center, where he found chaos. Station personnel were frantically trying to identify the new arrivals, while the 7 warlord fleets that had been maintaining their careful peace around the station suddenly found themselves facing a common threat. Unknown vessels. This is Commander Cho Jihan of Station Operations, the station commander was saying into his communicator. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. The response came in, a voice that seemed to scrape across broken glass and made everyone in the command center wince. We are the devourers of the 5th void. This system now belongs to us. All present vessels will surrender immediately or be destroyed. Minho arrived in the command center wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon cats and carrying a cup of coffee that he had somehow found time to make despite the crisis. His casual appearance would have been funny if not for the seriousness of the situation. Well, he said, studying the tactical display that showed the enormous enemy fleet. This is unexpected. The Devourer fleet was terrifying. The ships were easily 3 times larger than anything in the system, and there were hundreds of them. Energy readings suggested weapons that could crack planets and shields that could absorb the firepower of entire fleets. Worse, their technology appeared to be far more advanced than anything the Warlords possessed. Commander Cho turned to Minho with desperation in his eyes. Sir, we need to evacuate the station immediately. That fleet could destroy us all without even slowing down. In normal circumstances, this would have been the moment when 30 years of warfare reasserted itself. Each warlord fleet would immediately retreat to protect their own territories, abandoning the others to face destruction alone. It was the logical choice. Preserve your forces, live to fight another day, worry about your own people first. Instead, something remarkable happened. Crimson Fleet to all vessels, Warlord Raxtool's voice boomed across the communication channels. I am transmitting joint tactical coordination protocols to all friendly ships. If we are going to face this threat, we face it together. Shadow Syndicate acknowledges. Warlord Chindar's voice followed immediately. My stealth ships are moving to flanking positions. We can provide reconnaissance and surprise attacks. One by one, all 7 warlords committed their forces to a joint defense. Fleets that had been shooting at each other for 3 decades were suddenly operating as a coordinated unit, sharing targeting data and tactical plans. Iron Brotherhood Engineering Corps standing by to coordinate point defense systems, Morgoth announced. Void Hunter phase ships moving to dimensional attack positions, Zixara added. Star Reaver swarm tactics ready for deployment, Kethmol clicked. Rapidly, Deathhead Corsairs prepared for close assault operations, Nulvex growled. Bone Fleet undead crews taking positions that living warriors cannot hold, Talorix said in his cold voice. Minho watched the tactical display as 7 different fleet configurations began merging into a single defensive formation. Ships that had been enemies yesterday were now sharing shield harmonics and weapon targeting data. It was unprecedented in galactic military history. How are they doing this so quickly? Commander Cho asked in amazement. They have been fighting each other for 30 years, Minho replied, sipping his coffee while studying the enemy approach. They know each other's capabilities better than anyone else in the galaxy. They know each other's weaknesses, too, which means they know how to cover for them. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for generations. The Devourers had expected easy pickings. Their intelligence suggested that the Outer Rim was controlled by feuding warlords, who would collapse at the first sign of organized resistance. Instead, they encountered something completely unexpected. The combined fleet used tactics that no single faction could have managed alone. Raxtool's heavy battleships formed the core of the defensive line, their massive armor and firepower absorbing the initial Devourer assault. Behind them, Chindar's stealth ships darted through the enemy formation like ghosts, striking at weak points and disappearing before return fire could target them. Morgoth's mechanical precision coordinated point defense, systems across all 7 fleets, creating overlapping fields of protective fire that shot down thousands of incoming missiles. Zixara's phase ships attacked from dimensions that the Devourers could not effectively defend against, striking at their engines and weapon systems from impossible angles. Kethmol's swarm tactics confused enemy targeting computers as thousands of small fighters moved in perfect coordination, making it impossible for the larger Devourer ships to track and engage them all. Nulvex's assault craft punched through enemy lines with berserker fury, boarding enemy ships and creating chaos from within. Most remarkably, Talorix's undead crews held positions that living warriors would have abandoned. Ships that should have been destroyed continued fighting even after catastrophic damage, their dead crews immune to fear, pain, or the psychological warfare that the Devourers used to break enemy morale. The battle lasted 14 hours. When it ended, the Devourer fleet was in full retreat, having lost over half their ships to an enemy they had expected to crush in minutes. In the aftermath, as damage reports came in and medical teams tended to the wounded, the 7 warlords found themselves in an unprecedented situation. They had won a victory that none of them could have achieved alone, and they had done it by working together. Minho called an emergency meeting in the same dining hall where they had shared their first meal just days earlier. The room now doubled as a command center, with tactical displays showing the retreating enemy fleet and damage assessments from the battle. Well, he said, looking around at the exhausted but victorious warlords, I think we need to discuss what happens next. The Devourers will return, Raxtool stated grimly, his armor scarred from the battle. This was clearly a scouting force. They will come back with more ships and better intelligence about our capabilities. Agreed, Chindar said, her form flickering with exhaustion. They expected us to be divided and weak. Now they know we can work together. They will adapt their strategy accordingly. So what do we do? Morgoth asked, his cybernetic system still running battle analysis protocols. Minho set down his coffee cup and smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. We get better at working together, because what you accomplished today was not luck or desperation. It was proof that your combined forces are stronger than the sum of their parts. He activated the holographic display, showing the tactical analysis of the battle. Look at this data. Every one of your fleets performed above expected parameters when working in coordination with the others. Your victory was not just about having more ships. It was about having better teamwork than your enemy expected. Warlord Kethmol's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. You are suggesting a formal military alliance. I am suggesting that you have already formed one, Minho corrected. The question is whether you want to make it official and permanent. The room fell silent as 7 of the most feared beings in the galaxy contemplated a future that none of them had imagined when they had first sat down for lunch together. Warlord Zixara spoke first, her form solid and serious. If we formalize this alliance, it changes everything. Our territories, our trade routes, our relationships with other powers. Are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for the alternative? Novex asked bluntly. The Devourers will return. Other threats will follow. Alone, we might survive. Together, we can thrive. Telorix nodded slowly. The dead remember everything. They remember 30 years of pointless warfare. They also remember today's victory. I vote for the alliance. One by one, the others agreed. As the sun rose over the neutral station, 7 former enemies formally became allies, bound together not by conquest or treaty negotiations, but by the simple discovery that they worked better together than apart. Minho smiled as he watched them, shake hands, exchange contact codes, and begin planning their new joint operations. His grandmother had been right about many things, but especially about the power of a shared meal to bring people together. The galaxy was about to discover that the 7 warlords of the Outer Rim were no longer its problem. They were about to become its greatest success story. 3 months after the battle with the Devourers, the Outer Rim territories were completely unrecognizable. Trade ships that had once traveled in armed convoys now moved freely between systems that had been war zones for decades. Refugee settlements had been transformed into thriving colonies. Pirates had largely disappeared, not because of military action, but because there were now legitimate jobs available for anyone willing to work. The transformation was so dramatic that news agencies from across the galaxy were calling it the miracle of the century. What had once been the most dangerous region of known space was becoming its most prosperous. The formal signing ceremony for the Outer Rim Cooperation Treaty was scheduled to take place on the same neutral station where everything had begun. Representatives from dozens of worlds were arriving to witness what the press had dubbed the Potluck Accords after learning about the unusual origins of the peace negotiations. Ambassador Kim Dae-ho from the Confederation's diplomatic corps arrived expecting a formal ceremony conducted according to standard galactic protocols. Instead, he found what appeared to be the largest community festival in the history of space exploration. Raxtool's Crimson Fleet had set up massive cooking stations throughout the station's main concourse. The smell of grilled food filled the air as his engineers, who had once designed weapons of war, now applied their technical skills to creating perfect barbecue systems. They were cooking things that Kim could not identify, but that smelled absolutely delicious. Chindar's Shadow Syndicate had used their stealth technology to create amazing light displays that danced through the air above the crowds. Children from a dozen different species chased the shifting patterns of light while their parents watched and laughed. The same technology that had once been used for assassination was now providing entertainment. Morgoth's Iron Brotherhood had constructed elaborate serving stations with mechanical precision. Robotic arms that had once assembled weapons now prepared, and served food with perfect efficiency. The former war machines had been reprogrammed to ensure that everyone at the festival was well-fed and comfortable. Zixara's Void Hunters had phased in tables and chairs that existed partially in other dimensions, creating seating areas that somehow accommodated far more people than should have been physically possible. The dimensional technology that had once made them impossible to fight was now solving logistical problems. At the center of it all was Minho, wearing a simple apron over his diplomatic uniform. He moved through the crowds with the easy confidence of someone who had somehow become the unofficial coordinator for what might have been the largest interspecies celebration in galactic history. Ambassador Kim, he called out cheerfully when he spotted the newcomer. Perfect timing. We are just About to start the formal presentations. Each faction prepared something special to share with everyone. What followed was unlike any treaty signing in recorded history. Instead of stern speeches about territorial boundaries and trade regulations, each warlord presented something personal that represented their people's contribution to the new alliance. Kethmols. Insect warriors performed a complex musical harmony that their translators rendered as a victory song celebrating new friendships. The sound was beautiful and alien, creating music that no single species could have produced alone. Nulvex's Deathhead Corsairs, who had once been feared throughout the galaxy for their violence, demonstrated the intricate art of their traditional brewing techniques. They had created drinks that were safe for multiple species to consume, sharing recipes that had been closely guarded secrets for generations. Even Talarix, whose necromantic practices had made others uncomfortable, contributed. Something meaningful. His people performed a ritual that honored those who had died in the 30 years of warfare, while celebrating the new life that peace would bring. It was moving and respectful, showing a side of his culture that no one had ever seen before. "This is highly irregular," Ambassador Kim whispered to his assistant Park Jisu as they watched former enemies teaching each other traditional dances. "Yes, sir," Jisu replied, "but it seems to be working remarkably well." The actual treaty signing was almost an afterthought. The document itself was surprisingly brief. Most of the complex negotiations had been completed during shared meals and casual conversations over the previous months. The 7 former warlords signed with minimal ceremony, but the celebration that followed lasted for days. During a quiet moment on the second day, Ambassador Kim found Minho standing on an observation deck, watching the combined fleets of the former enemies flying in perfect formation during a ceremonial display. "How did you do it?" Kim asked directly. 30 years of warfare, thousands of ships destroyed, millions of lives lost, and you solved it by serving lunch? Minho considered the question while watching children from different species playing together in the station's recreational areas. These were kids who had grown up expecting to be enemies, but they were laughing and having fun together as if war had never existed. "I think they solved it themselves," Minho replied thoughtfully. "I just gave them permission to try something different." Sometimes the hardest part of peace is not finding solutions. It is getting people to admit that they want to find them. But why food? Why that specific approach? "Because food is honest," Minho said simply. "You cannot fake enjoying a meal, and you cannot share one with someone you completely hate. When you sit down to eat together, you are forced to see each other as people instead of problems to be solved. After that, everything else becomes negotiable." He gestured toward the festival happening throughout the station. "Look at them. A week ago, some of these people were shooting at each other. Today, they are sharing recipes and planning joint exploration missions. The only thing that changed was that they started talking to each other instead of about each other." Ambassador Kim watched as Warlord Raxtul's daughter, who had arrived with one of the supply convoys, was teaching a traditional Crimson Fleet game to children from all 7 factions. The sight of the next generation playing together instead of preparing for war seemed to represent everything the Alliance had achieved. "What happens now?" Kim asked. "Now they become what they were always capable of being," Minho replied. "Not warlords or enemies, but leaders who can work together to build something better than any of them could create alone." A communication. Alert interrupted their conversation. The station's long-range sensors had detected another large fleet approaching the system. For a moment, both ambassadors tensed, remembering the Devourer attack. Then the identification signals came through, and Minho smiled. "Ah, the delegation from the Andromeda Spiral. 3 hive mind species that have been fighting over territory for over a century. The Galactic Council asked if I would be willing to help with their situation." Ambassador Kim stared at him. "You are going to try the same approach with hive minds?" "Why not?" Minho said cheerfully. "Everyone needs to eat, and I have been researching recipes that are compatible with collective consciousness. It should be an interesting challenge." As they watched the approaching ships, Ambassador Kim realized that he was witnessing the birth of something completely new in galactic diplomacy. The success of the Outer Rim Alliance had proven that there were alternatives to traditional power politics and military solutions. Throughout the station, the celebration continued. Former enemies shared meals and stories. Children played games that mixed traditions from 7 different cultures. Engineers and scientists collaborated on projects that would benefit everyone. Artists and musicians created new forms of expression that combined the best of multiple species. The Potluck Accords had done more than end a war. They had created a new model for how different peoples could live and work together. As news of the alliance spread throughout the galaxy, other regions began requesting similar assistance with their own conflicts. Minho had started with one simple idea: that most problems could be improved by good food and honest conversation. He had ended up changing the way an entire galaxy thought about peace, cooperation, and the possibility that former enemies could become friends. His grandmother would have been proud. She had always said that the best way to change the world was one meal at a time. As it turned out, she had been right about that too. The festival continued around them, but both ambassadors stood in comfortable silence, watching the birth of what historians would later call the most successful peace agreement in galactic history. It was an agreement that had been forged not in conference rooms or battlefields, but around dinner tables, where people had learned to see each other as worthy of respect, friendship, and trust. 5 years after the first shared meal that changed the galaxy, Ambassador Lee Hyunwoo stood in his office aboard Harmony Station. The facility had been renamed and expanded far beyond its original size. What had once been a simple neutral meeting point was now the bustling capital of the Outer Rim Alliance and one of the most important diplomatic centers in known space. Through his wide windows, Hyunwoo could see ships from dozens of worlds arriving and departing in peaceful commerce. Crimson Fleet cargo vessels loaded with rare minerals docked next to Shadow Syndicate passenger liners full of tourists. Iron Brotherhood construction mechs worked alongside Void Hunter engineers to expand the station's facilities. The sight would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Minho had been promoted to Director of Interstellar Cultural Exchange, a position created specifically for him after the incredible success of what everyone still called the Potluck Accords. His unconventional methods had been so effective that the Galactic Confederation had begun implementing collaborative dining protocols throughout their entire diplomatic system. Hyunwoo was reviewing the morning reports when his assistant, Commander Park Minji, entered with barely controlled excitement. "Sir, we have received a priority message from the Galactic Council. There is a crisis in the Andromeda Spiral region. 3 different hive mind species have been fighting over territory for over a century. They are specifically requesting Director Minho for consultation." Hyunwoo smiled, imagining his predecessor's reaction to being asked to mediate between species that shared collective consciousness but apparently could not share space peacefully. What was his response? He asked about their dietary requirements and whether our food preparation facilities could handle ingredients compatible with collective metabolisms. He also requested information about how hive minds experience taste and whether shared consciousness affects food preferences. The success of the Outer Rim Alliance had created ripple effects throughout the galaxy that continued to surprise everyone. The combined fleets had not only defended their territory against the Devourers, they had driven the hostile forces completely out of this entire galactic region. Trade routes that had been dangerous for generations were now among the safest in known space. More importantly, the former Warlords had evolved into something completely different. Raxtool had transformed the Crimson Fleet from a purely military organization into a combination defense force and emergency response team. When natural disasters struck anywhere in Alliance space, his ships were usually the first to arrive with aid and supplies. Chindar's Shadow Syndicate had become the intelligence and communication network that kept the Alliance functioning smoothly. Their stealth technology and information-gathering capabilities ensured that problems were identified and solved before they could grow into serious conflicts. Each of the former warlords had found new purposes that used their strengths to serve the greater good of all their people. More importantly, they had trained their successors in the same collaborative principles, ensuring that the peace would continue long after the original leaders were gone. The cultural changes were perhaps even more significant than the political ones. The annual Potluck Festival had become the most celebrated holiday in Alliance space. Entire star systems participated in massive communal celebrations that lasted for weeks. Children who had grown up during the Alliance years spoke multiple languages fluently and thought of former enemy territories as natural places to study, work, or visit. These young people had no memory of the old conflicts. To them, cooperation between different species and cultures was normal. The idea of shooting at someone because they came from a different star system seemed as absurd as fighting over what color clothes to wear. Hyunwoo's thoughts were interrupted by another message. Sir, Director Minho is requesting permission to transport several tons of specialized food preparation equipment to the Andromeda Spiral. He says he needs to adapt his recipes for hive mind dietary requirements and collective taste experiences. Approved immediately, Hyunwoo replied without hesitation. And make sure he has full access to our cultural and biological databases. If anyone can teach 3 hive minds to share territory peacefully, it is him. As the day shift transitioned, to evening, Hyunwoo made his way to the communal dining hall. The massive space could accommodate thousands of beings from dozens of different species. The walls were decorated with photographs and artifacts from the early days of the Alliance, including a carefully preserved sample of the original kimchi that had started everything. The hall was filled with the usual dinner crowd, representing the new reality of the Outer Rim. Families from different factions shared tables as if they had been neighbors for generations. Young people from former enemy worlds were dating, studying together, and planning futures that crossed old boundaries. Elderly veterans from the war years told stories to children who listened with fascination rather than fear. In one corner, a group of Iron Brotherhood engineers were teaching traditional cooking techniques to anyone interested in learning. Near the large windows, a mixed group was planning the next expansion of the station's agricultural sections to accommodate even more species. Hyunwoo found his usual table and was soon joined by others. This had become a natural tradition that evolved from Minho's original belief that meals were better when shared. Tonight's dinner companions included a Void Hunter physicist, a former Deathhead corsair who now managed refugee settlement programs, a young diplomat from Earth studying Alliance integration methods, and a merchant family whose children had been born in Alliance space and considered it their true home. As they shared the evening meal and discussed the day's events, Hyunwoo reflected on the simple brilliance of what Minho had accomplished. He had not ended 30 years of warfare through superior military strategy or brilliant political maneuvering. He had ended it by reminding everyone involved that they were people first and enemies second, and that people could choose to stop being enemies if they wanted to. The conversation around the table flowed easily between languages and topics. They discussed everything from trade negotiations to family news to philosophical questions about the nature of peace and cooperation. It was the kind of comfortable, natural interaction that the old warring factions had never been able to imagine. Later, that evening, as Hyunwoo completed his daily reports, he received a message from the outer monitoring stations. Long-range sensors had detected the Devourer fleet returning to this region. The hostile force was at least 10 times larger than their previous invasion, clearly intending to reclaim the territory they had been driven from years earlier. 5 years ago, such news would have meant panic and desperate preparations for war. Each faction would have immediately retreated to protect their own territories, abandoning their allies to face destruction alone. Instead, Hyun-woo simply forwarded the tactical information to the Alliance Defense Committee and authorized the activation of joint response protocols. Within hours, 7 fleets that had once been mortal enemies would be operating as a single, perfectly coordinated force. Their combined strength, enhanced by 5 years of technological sharing and tactical integration, would face the threat with capabilities that far exceeded anything the region had ever possessed. But their greatest strength was not their weapons or their numbers. It was their unity. They would face this threat together, bound not by treaties or political agreements, but by genuine friendship and shared commitment to protecting the home they had built together. As Hyun-woo prepared for what would certainly be a challenging few days, he smiled at the thought of Minho's probable reaction to the news. Knowing the director, he would likely suggest hosting a celebration feast after the battle, with special arrangements to accommodate any surviving devourers who might be interested in learning about the benefits of cooperation over conquest. After all, as Minho's grandmother had always said, there was no problem that could not be improved by good food and honest conversation. The galaxy had learned that she was right about most things, especially about the power of shared meals to transform enemies into friends. The alliance had been born around a dinner table, and it would endure because its people understood that the strongest bonds were not those forced by conquest or maintained by fear. The strongest bonds were those chosen freely between friends who had decided to share their lives, their cultures, and their future together. Outside the station windows, the combined fleets of 7 former enemy factions prepared to defend their home against an external threat. They moved with the precision and coordination that could only come from years of genuine partnership. They were no longer the 7 warlords who had once terrorized this region of space. They had become something far more powerful. They had become a family, and families protect each other. The legacy of one human diplomat who believed that sharing a meal could change, the world had proven that even the most impossible conflicts could be resolved when people took the time to see each other as worthy of respect and friendship. As the battle alerts began sounding throughout the station, families calmly made their way to secure areas. There was no panic, no fear that the Alliance would abandon them. Children who had grown up in peace trusted that the adults who protected them would continue to do so. Teenagers from different species helped elderly beings to safety while discussing their plans for after the crisis passed. In the command center, the 7 former warlords coordinated their response with the easy efficiency of old friends working together. Raxtul's tactical planning meshed perfectly with Chindar's intelligence gathering. Morgoth's technological expertise supported Zixara's dimensional strategies. Kethmol's swarm coordination worked in harmony with Nulvex's assault planning and Telorix's unconventional approaches. They had learned that their different strengths made them stronger together than any of them could be alone. What had started as a desperate alliance against a common threat had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. A genuine partnership between former enemies who had chosen to become family. As the Devourer fleet approached, confident in their overwhelming numbers and superior technology, they had no idea what they were about to face. They expected to find the same fractured, feuding warlords they had encountered before. Instead, they would discover something that their military planning had never anticipated. They would face an enemy that fought not just for territory or resources, but for the people they loved and the home they had built together. They would face the power of unity born not from conquest or force, but from the simple human understanding that sharing a meal can be the first step toward sharing a future. The galaxy was about to witness once again the truth that Minho's grandmother had always known, that the strongest bonds between people are forged not in battle, but around the dinner table, where enemies can become friends, and friends can become family. The Outer Rim Alliance stood ready to defend everything they had built together, one shared meal at a time.